How often have you walked up to the Coolins in Skye and said, wow, £50 million? Or Robin Hood's Bay and gone, £30 million, etc., etc. Arguably a bit of a cheap shot, but it does betray there is this thing between how a lot of people view this subject. When I told people I was coming to do this debate tonight, and I said it's all about whether we should put a monetary value or a price tag on nature, most people I say this to look a little bit perplexed. They don't quite kind of get it. And yet, at the same time, I've been told when I've been making programs about this that we need to put a money tag on it because it's the only language that they understand. They, in this context, means politicians, decision makers, people routing the HS2. That's what they means. So is it possible to bridge that gap between the public understanding of nature and natural value, beauty, and possibly what some of the decision makers are thinking?
I've been working in the conservation field for more than 30 years, and my motivation to conserve endangered species, to stop the destruction of ecosystems like tropical rainforests, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and to clean up air and water is because I have a set of values that believe this is the right thing to do. Nature is beautiful. It needs to be conserved for its own sake, and we should protect it because we should hand it on to future generations. I note, however, after 3 decades, and we've had some successes, is that pretty much all of the indicators we should be concerned about, the number of species listed in red data books, the status of tropical forests, the CO2 in the atmosphere, all of these things are still getting worse. And one of the reasons why I think this is the case is because not everybody is a conservationist. And whilst those of us on the panel here might see the beauty and the reasons to protect nature for its own sake, I fear that most people don't think that, or at least it's not the first thing they think. Tom mentioned the role of decision makers, running companies, running government departments, being elected to political office. They certainly don't see this as the first thing they're concerned about when they make big decisions. They're primarily concerned about economic growth, development, and human progress, and very often you will hear them say that environmental questions get in the way of that, and that's why we have to sacrifice environmental assets in order to achieve progress. Most recently, you will have heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer talking in terms that really underline this kind of perspective. The Habitats Directive, the most important legislation we have for protecting animals and plants and natural habitats in this country, he described as a ridiculous burden on British business. We have to weaken it in order to permit economic growth. Now, it seems to me we have a choice. We can either tell the Chancellor that nature is more important than the economy, or we can point out to him, using good numbers and metrics, that actually he's completely wrong, and that the opposite is the case, and that without nature there can be no economy, because nature's providing incalculable economic services which include flood protection, purification of water, pollination, soil fertility, and all of these other things that underpin economic development. And that's why we have to protect nature, alongside the fact that it is beautiful, that it is spiritually enriching, that it is aesthetically beautiful, and scientifically it's an enormous source of human wisdom and innovation. All those things are true, and it seems to me the thing we now have to add to all of that is that it's also economically rational to save the natural environment, those species, those endangered habitats.
It's better to buy something than it is to steal it, isn't it? My mum's Australian, and her ancestors were sold land where they settled for £1 an acre. It wasn't the Aborigines who sold them the land, it was the British Empire. What value did that land have for the indigenous Aborigines? In monetary terms, nothing. They didn't have money, they didn't need it, they had nature. Now that farmland is worth a lot of money because other people want to buy it for development, but what is its real value? Money is a crude way of transferring economic value from one good or service to another. If I make shoes and you are a farmer, I will always need food, but you only need shoes when yours wear out. In the end, without money, I will starve long before you get blisters. That's why money is a useful tool for lubricating social interactions. But not everything can have a monetary value. So should we place a value on nature? Would you sell your parents or your children? Would you feel able to put a financial value on them? It has happened before, and it continues to happen. It's called slavery. Slavery wasn't abolished because slaves became too expensive, because of market forces, but because people decided that it was unethical to trade in human lives. Did anyone suggest that freeing up the market for slaves would help consign slavery to history? No. A campaign was launched and fought over decades until laws were passed banning slavery. This is the situation we find ourselves in now with nature. Much is made of the value of ecosystem services, the things nature provides to humanity for free, but this language is disingenuous at best. A service provider is paid for the service they provide. Take Transport for London. When you get on the tube, you pay for a ticket. In return for your payment, you receive a service. You don't just help yourself. If you do, expect to be punished. Yet, that is exactly what we have done with nature. A large part of nature is now tied to the yoke of humanity. That is ecosystem servitude. As humanity, we need to consider our relationship with nature, to recognize that we are part of nature, to find another way to live harmoniously alongside the rest of nature. This starts with the education system. We need to give children the opportunity, knowledge and understanding to appreciate and value nature for all its glories, not see it as a resource to exploit or another asset class to be traded. Seeking more answers in the illusions of the market will take us away from this goal.
In the last 150 years, the UK population has doubled. The global population has increased sixfold. Over the next 25 years, the UK will need to house 10 million more people, and this will require 200,000 more houses to be added to our housing stock every year. So the natural resource scarcities of the past are minor compared to what is going to be coming now, with more people doing more stuff, facing unprecedented environmental changes. We now also face this sideswipe from climate and land use change that will make maintaining the status quo difficult, let alone dealing with these legitimate increasing demands. Now, when resources are scarce, choices have to be made. And choices lead to priorities, and priorities imply some kind of valuation. The minute you do one thing before another, that thing has had the higher value put on it. Valuation is simply unavoidable. So the question for me is not whether we should value nature. I think we must do so. If we don't, someone else is going to value it for us. We have to take the how seriously. It's not whether to value nature, it's how to value it. And how to value nature depends on the ultimate goal of the valuation. Just helping someone get rich quick because they're fortunate to control a limited natural resource is not going to help us in this longer-term goal of sustainability. What we need to do is make sure that there are funds for nature's protection, restoration, and enhancement. And it's possible, as was done here, to incorporate in these costs and benefits the externalities, to remove the distorting effects of taxes and subsidies, and to use robust valuation metrics that represent inclusive outcomes for public health and well-being. But I fully agree that there are some elements of nature for which this is very difficult, if not impossible. And here I refer to wild species and habitats and the aesthetic, educational, inspirational, and other values that people hold for wild nature, which I'm sure are very important to many people here. There are methods that economists use to put a monetary value on these, but they're at best unreliable and at worst pretty damaging. So how to deal with these difficult areas? My suggestion is this all becomes much clearer if it is the state of nature that is at the heart of the valuation, and the value is represented as the cost of returning the current state of nature to the desirable one. Then it's straightforward to consider the condition needed for successfully conserving species and habitats, such as those that conservation plans prescribe. The annual cost of maintaining and or restoring a woodland, say, to meet this condition, is then deducted from the benefits that accrue. In this way, the better managed the woodland is, the greater the benefits. I don't think any of this is impossible to do. Certainly it's harder than letting the market decide, but it's much more effective. And it's certainly better than simply not putting a value on nature at all and continuing to treat it as if it was either infinite or of no value at all, and thereby continuing to trash it, to our cost, but also to the cost of generations to come.
So the literal answer to tonight's question is pretty easy. No, nature doesn't come with a price tag. I've never seen a bit of nature with a price tag on. Economies, in fact, exist inside ecosystems, not the other way around. The world is not made of capital, but the metaphors and metrics that we talk about it with and measure it with actually shape reality. They don't just reflect it. Just as people are not human capital, the non-human world in all its dazzling variety is not really natural capital. Of course, we all know this, everyone here knows this, but having acknowledged it, enthusiasts for these approaches swiftly move on to talk and act as if it was, and in so doing, they inevitably de-emphasise that variety, as well as confusing values with prices. There's always a little caveat at the beginning that says, of course, some people think nature has intrinsic value, and we agree with that. After all, who are we to disagree? We're just the economists. But we can't count that, so we're going to proceed with the things we can count. The National Ecosystem Assessment was a great recent example of exactly this approach. So capital is actually a concept that makes sense only within a very particular set of social relations. It's the one that we all inhabit, but it's not the only one. Fundamentally, capital is something that can be traded, something liquid, something that is of value not because of what it is, but because of what it can buy. After all, once you've seen one £10 note, you've kind of seen them all. The very idea of natural capital relies on problematic assumptions of commensurability, the idea that one thing is tradable against another, as nicely captured in ideas like aggregate natural capital or the offsetting of carbon or of biodiversity. The idea of trading and substituting one form of capital for another is at the centre of the whole approach. And when people tell you that it's not, they've either missed something or they're being disingenuous. Substitution, not just between different forms of natural capital, but between natural capital and financial or social or human capital, so-called. The metaphor of natural capital deliberately begs this key question of what theorists call substitutability. A bit of a chewy word, but it's fairly obvious what it means. It's hardly surprising, though, since the concept was created precisely in order to reframe the whole issue of ecological sustainability as a simple problem capable of being analysed and solved using the tools of economics and finance. But as the psychologist Abraham Maslow pointed out, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, you tend to treat everything as if it was a nail. This is a big problem in many contexts, but certainly in this one. Not only because some things are hard or even impossible to price, but also because in many cases, pricing things can actually endanger them. Once you price something, it is for sale. We might say that it's not, and yet we're saying that we're going to talk to George Osborne in these terms.
Taking my cue from the Republican primaries that we've all been enjoying, I'd like to start tonight with some sneering and with some contempt. The object of my disdain is a case study in naivety that I know all too well because it's my own. We published a paper of which I was very proud. It combined cutting-edge isotope chemistry with quite an advanced understanding of fish physiology, in particular how we could use the growth lines in these otoliths, these ear bones of the fish, to measure their development. With hours of back-breaking work in our mangrove forest field site in Gazi Bay in southern Kenya to show how the juvenile fish that live in that forest grow up to be adults on the coral reef over some 5 kilometres away, and there they contribute to an important commercial fishery and also to the evening meals of the people who live in and around the forest. Now, I like this paper because I thought it was quite neat science, but I also thought it conformed to a kind of implicit theory of change that I was carrying in my head at the time, which went something like this. My job as an ecological scientist is to understand and explore some of the complexities that underlie the ecological problems we face, problems like the rapid loss of the world's mangrove forests. And then I just need to publish this information to an eager and expectant audience that includes politicians and managers and decision makers, and these influential people will be guided by my wise words and change the world for the better. Well, it took a rather disturbing incident that same year of 2007 to disabuse me of this simplistic notion. I was walking through Ghazi village one evening, and Hamisi, a village elder, took me by the arm and led me to the madrasa. And there were 12 men waiting to speak to me there, and they had a simple question for me. They said, "Mark, you've been working in our village now for 4 years. Explain to us how your research benefits us and our families." And I was really shocked because I'd somehow assumed that because I was doing important science and because I was publishing it in these prestigious scientific journals, that would translate into benefit for poor people who relied on mangrove forests. So after that challenge, after Hamisi's challenge, we introduced a different element to our research program, one that focused much more closely on people and their relationship with the environment. And that included, one part of that was ecosystem valuation of the kinds we've been discussing. That's a typically beautiful Sri Lankan mangrove lagoon, and this is how 70% of these lagoons now look on the west coast of the country because they've been converted into shrimp farming. Now, when most people hear about this story, they assume it's a sad illustration of economic logic steamrolling over ecological sustainability. But if you conduct an economic valuation, this is what you find. The mangrove forest, left alone, is at least 3 or 4 times more valuable than the shrimp farm. So what we're looking at here is not economics, we're looking at power, we're looking at the functions of power. A few rich people benefit from shrimp farms, many poor people lose out. So what this teaches us is economics can be used as a weapon on the side of the poor and the powerless. And secondly, it teaches us that it's not enough to engage with economics. We need to engage with power structures as well. I started this presentation with a sneer. I'd like to end it with a few smiles. If we don't meet Hamisi's challenge, if we don't show how our ecological knowledge can be of relevance to people and particularly to the poor, then I think much of the wild will be lost. Mikoko Pamoja is one example of how we can combine ecology with economics for the benefit of nature and for the benefit of the people who rely most intimately upon her.
So this is Yasuni National Park in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Yasuni is a biodiversity hotspot. Its list of species borders on the surreal. For example, an average upland hectare here contains more tree species than the US and Canada combined. Biologically, then, Yasuni holds irreplaceable planetary value. Culturally, it's home to indigenous peoples whose ancestors have used and tended this natural value for probably millennia. If any place on the planet should be worth more as it is than through its transformation for economic development, it is this. But in a real-world case of creating a new economics for the planet, even Yasuni could not raise the payments needed to prevent its economic transformation for economic gain. This is what happened. The problem for Yasuni is that more than 800 million barrels of crude oil lie beneath its soil, and they're shown in yellow on this map. In 2007, Ecuador's President Rafael Correa offered to forgo extraction of this oil so as to preserve the global heritage of Yasuni. He offered to sell the right to exploit the oil in return for payments from the international community for only half of the foregone oil revenue. In other words, it was a conservation bargain. A payment structure was created so that individuals and organizations could purchase protection of Yasuni through buying certificates guaranteeing that the oil would remain underground. The investments were placed in a fund managed by the United Nations, and interest earned would be invested in Ecuador's transition to a low-carbon economy. All of this was promoted during a visible international moment. the 15th Conference of Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2009. It was, you could say, a multiple-win situation. But instead, the market for yes-or-no guarantee certificates failed to attract enough buyers. By 2013, and amid significant resistance, Correa claimed that economically, Ecuador had no choice but to go ahead and start drilling. The yes-or-no fund is now closed, and money paid in has been reimbursed. Oil is being extracted from within yes-or-no, and oil spills in the heart of the forest have occurred. What this demonstrates is that there's nothing intrinsic to placing a monetary value on nature to suggest that habitats will be protected. Indeed, the logic that suggests that we can use a system lethal to nature in order to save nature seems to be fooling us on a massive scale, as Einstein might also have observed. If we humans wish to live in more mutually flourishing relationships with the diverse entities comprising nature, we may need to address the sacred cows of economic growth and inequality. We might need to celebrate that less can be more and that abundance is created through sharing rather than accumulation. This means creating mechanisms to redistribute accumulated wealth rather than using environmental crisis to create more mechanisms whereby this wealth can be enhanced. But above all, I think we need to be positive about cultivating a change of heart so that we can re-find ourselves to be one species amongst many who are indigenous rather than masters over this earth. Thank you.
We have, of course, got to put our minds to a little bit of a vote. So the question that we are asking is, should we put a price tag on nature in order to conserve it? I'd like to avoid abstentions, although I can imagine there's a lot of you thinking, well, in some cases yes, some cases no. But anyway, so who thinks that yes, we should put a price tag on nature in order to conserve it? Hands in the air, please. Okay, and who thinks we should not? I think slightly in favour of the yes. I'd give it about 55-45 in percentage terms. It's good enough for you, isn't it? Thank you very much indeed for coming and making such an excellent debate. Particularly thank you to the panel.